The night before my father's retirement gala, our building security guard stopped me in the parking garage and said, very quietly, "Don't go up yet." I almost laughed. I had a garment bag over one arm, heels already on, mascara still drying. I was running 12 minutes late and completely unprepared for what he was about to tell me. "My name is Lydia. I'm 31 years old. For the past 6 years, I've been the operations director of a mid-sized logistics company my father built out of a warehouse in Brampton. I helped him scale it. I restructured the vendor contracts. I personally negotiated the deal with our largest Ontario distribution partner that doubled our revenue in 18 months. I also did all of this while my younger brother floated through the sales department collecting a salary and attending maybe 60% of his meetings. So when Gerald, the night security guard who'd worked our building for 9 years and always saved me a parking spot near the elevator, pulled me aside and said, "Ms. Lydia, something doesn't feel right about tonight," I stopped. Because Gerald didn't do that. Gerald told you to have a good evening and meant it. He wasn't the type to be dramatic. He said, "There were people in the boardroom this afternoon. Not the usual people. Your brother and someone from legal and a man I didn't recognize. They were there for almost 2 hours. And when they left, your brother was laughing." He looked at me steady. "I don't know what it means, but I thought you should know before you walked into that room." I thanked him. I meant it. I told him I'd let him know how it went. I took the elevator up to the 14th floor and smiled at everyone I was supposed to smile at. For context on our family, my father came to Canada from Portugal in 1989. He built the company slowly and carefully over 20 years. When I joined after my MBA, he gave me real responsibility because, as he said then, "You understand the bones of a business, Lydia. You see the whole structure." My brother, 4 years younger, joined 3 years after me. He was charming. He was great at client dinners. He was not particularly interested in the structural bones of anything. What I didn't know, the night of that gala, was that 6 weeks earlier, my brother had approached a private equity contact in Calgary, a firm that had been circling our company for 2 years. And he had done it without telling me, without telling our father, technically, though I would find out later that my father knew more than he let on. The deal they'd been quietly structuring would transfer controlling operational authority to my brother as the incoming CEO, position my father as chair emeritus with no day-to-day role, and remove me from the organizational chart entirely. Not fire me outright, something worse. The restructuring would eliminate my position as a category while keeping the responsibilities distributed across 3 junior managers who would report to my brother. On paper, it was a leadership transition. In practice, it was a disappearing act. And they had planned to announce it that night. The gala was at the Arcadian Court in downtown Toronto. My father had rented the whole venue. There were 200 guests, including our major clients, our bank contacts, our distribution partners, and about 40 employees who'd flown in from our Calgary and Vancouver offices. It was beautiful. Ivory tablecloths, the kind of lighting that makes everything look slightly more significant than it actually is. I sat at the head table beside my father. My brother sat on his other side with his girlfriend, who kept touching his arm in that specific way people do when they know something you don't and are trying not to look like they know it. The evening moved the way these evenings do. Speeches. Videos. A slideshow of my father's career that made several people cry, including me, genuinely, because whatever was happening politically inside this company, he had built something real and that was also real. And then, after dessert, my father stood up. He talked about legacy. He talked about the next generation. He talked about the importance of knowing when to hand something over to someone who has the hunger for it. He used the word hunger 3 times. I noticed because I was listening very carefully by that point. Then he said, "I'm proud to announce that effective the 1st of next month, my son will be assuming the role of Chief Executive Officer of the company I've spent 30 years building." Applause. My brother stood up. He shook my father's hand. He hugged him. He turned to the room with that easy grin of his and said something self-deprecating that made everyone laugh. I kept my face completely still. Then my brother said, "And I want to take a moment to acknowledge the leadership team who will be supporting this next chapter. and he named 4 people. None of them were me. The table to my left was our regional distribution partner from Mississauga, a man I'd personally negotiated 3 contract renewals with over 5 years. He looked at me with genuine confusion. I gave him the smallest possible smile. The kind that means I know, I'm fine. Keep eating. My brother sat back down. My father didn't look at me. My brother leaned across my father and touched my arm and said, quietly, "We'll talk tomorrow. This is the right move for the company. You know that." I nodded like someone who might believe him. Then I excused myself to use the washroom and stood in a bathroom stall at the Arcadian Court for 4 minutes just breathing. I was not going to cry. Not there. Pain, when it's that specific, doesn't feel like pain immediately. It feels like a very sudden silence inside your own chest. Like something switched off. I stood there and I thought about every 14-hour day I'd put into that company. The summer I skipped my cousin's wedding in the Algarve because we had a warehouse audit. The relationship I let drift apart at 27 because I was always working. The loan I quietly co-signed for our Calgary expansion 2 years ago that my father asked me not to mention to my brother because it would create tension. I thought about Gerald in the parking garage, and the way he'd said, "I thought you should know." I touched up my lipstick. I went back out to the table. I toasted my brother when everyone toasted my brother. I said something gracious to my father when the evening ended. Then I drove home alone and sat at my kitchen table in Leslieville until 2 in the morning. Here is what they forgot about me. 3 years ago, when we were restructuring our vendor relationships, I was the one who insisted on including what our legal team called personal continuity clauses in our 2 largest supply agreements. The logic at the time was simple. Our primary contacts at both companies had strong working relationships with me, specifically, and if I ever left, we needed a transition protocol to protect the contracts. My father agreed. My brother wasn't in the room. Those clauses required mutual written consent from both parties, including me by name and title, before any organizational restructuring could affect the active contract terms. I was also the one who, 18 months ago, had negotiated the renewal of our Central Ontario distribution agreement with a man named Mr. Patterson. He was old school. He didn't like uncertainty. He had specifically asked me to include a clause requiring 60 days written notice from a named company officer before any leadership change could take effect in relation to the contract. I was that named officer. They had restructured the company. They had not restructured those contracts because they didn't know those clauses existed, or they assumed I'd cooperate, or they simply hadn't thought it through. Any of those was possible. My brother was not a details person. I opened my laptop. I pulled up every agreement I had ever personally negotiated for that company. Then I read them. All of them. The way I hadn't read them in years because I knew what was in them. I'd written half of them. By 3 a.m., I wasn't sad anymore. I was organized. Monday morning at 9 a.m. was my brother's first official day as CEO. I knew there was an onboarding call with the PE firm from Calgary at 9:30. I knew because our executive assistant had forwarded me the calendar invite before anyone thought to remove my access. At 8:55, I sent a short professional email to both of our major supply vendors. I did not make accusations. I did not explain anything emotional. I simply noted that I had not been consulted regarding the organizational transition announced Friday evening, that my continued engagement was required under the personal continuity clauses of our existing agreements, and that until formal notification procedures had been completed as specified in those contracts, I could not confirm the operational handover was contractually valid. 2 sentences, clean, polite, devastating. At 9:12, I received a call from the VP of supply chain at our largest vendor. He said, "Lydia, I just got an unusual email from you." I said, "Yes, I wanted to make sure you were aware of the clause provisions before anything moved forward." He said, "We weren't told about any leadership change." I said, "I know." He said, "I'm going to need to loop in our legal team." I said, "Of course. That's the right thing to do." At 9:24, my brother texted me, "Lydia, what did you do?" I didn't reply. At 9:31, the Calgary PE firm postponed the onboarding call. I know this because the executive assistant, who had not yet updated the calendar permissions, forwarded me the cancellation notification by accident. At 9:47, Mr. Patterson called me directly, not my brother. Me. He said, "I heard there's been some movement over there." I said, "Yes, there's been some reorganization announced." He said, "I want to understand what this means for our agreement." I said, "So do I," which is why I reached out. He appreciated that. He always appreciated directness. At 10:15, my father called. I let it ring. At 10:22, my brother showed up at my apartment. This was not something I expected. He must have driven from the North York office in under 30 minutes, which tells you how seriously he'd suddenly started taking logistics. He knocked. I let him stand there for a moment before I opened the door. He looked like someone who had spent the weekend imagining a different version of Monday morning. He said, "Do you understand what you've just done?" I said, "I protected my contractual interests." He said, "You're blowing up Dad's company." I said, "I'm exercising clauses that have existed in our vendor agreements for 3 years. You didn't know about them. That's not my fault." He said, "Lydia, come on. You knew this transition was coming." I looked at him for a long time. He was my brother. I had covered for him in client meetings. I had fixed his expense reports. I had once stayed on a conference call from a hospital waiting room because he'd double booked himself and needed someone to handle it. I said, "I knew nothing about this transition. I found out at Dad's retirement party in front of 200 people when neither of you mentioned my name once." He didn't have a good answer for that. He said, "We should have handled it differently." I said, "Yes." He said, "Can we fix this?" I said, "Maybe, but that depends entirely on what you mean by fix." He left without a clear answer. I made coffee. I went back to my laptop. By Tuesday, both vendor legal teams had flagged the contracts for formal review. By Wednesday, the PE firm had quietly requested a due diligence extension, pending confirmation of operational continuity. By Thursday, our bank contact in the commercial lending division called to ask whether the transition had been fully executed, because there were some questions about the covenant structure tied to our operating line. I had not called the bank. I hadn't needed to. The system was doing what systems do when you pull out a structural support and no one told the building. My father showed up Thursday evening. He sat in my living room like someone who didn't quite recognize it, which was funny because he'd bought me the couch for my birthday 3 years ago. He said, "We made a mistake in how we did this." I said, "Which part?" He said, "We should have included you." I said, "You mean in the planning or in the company?" He looked at the floor. My father is not a man who looks at the floor. He said, "Your brother came to me with a PE proposal. It was a strong offer. He said you'd understand the business rationale." I said, "He told you I would understand being erased from the company I helped build." He said, "It wasn't about erasing you." I said, "Then what was it about?" He didn't answer. My mother called me that night. She didn't say much. She said, "I hope you know I didn't know everything." I said, "I believe you. I wasn't sure if I fully did, but it was what I had." My brother tried one more time on Friday evening. He came without arrogance this time. Just tired, he sat across from me and said, "What do you actually want here, Lydia?" I said, "I want what I'm owed." He said, "Which is?" I said, "Fair market value for my operational contributions to the company over 6 years, formalized in a buyout, clean documentation, and I want Gerald from Building Security to receive a bonus from the company, which I'll explain to HR as a long service recognition." He asked no questions about Gerald. I didn't explain. My brother said the PE firm isn't going to love a buyout at this stage. I said, "The PE firm is currently sitting on a paused due diligence process with 2 active vendor contracts under legal review and a bank covenant question open. I think they'll find a buyout preferable to the alternative." He sat with that for a moment. He said, "You mapped this out." I said, "I've been mapping things out for 6 years. You just didn't notice." The settlement meeting happened the following Tuesday. a boardroom, and a neutral office building on Bay Street. My father, his lawyer, my brother, and me. They had numbers ready. They were lower than what I calculated. I had my own numbers ready. I slid the folder across the table without explanation. I said, I'm not here to fight. I'm here to leave cleanly. My father's lawyer looked at the folder. He looked at my father. He said something about the complexity of the clause structure and the vendor exposure. My father nodded slowly. I said, I haven't accused anyone of anything. What I've done is create a situation where continuing without resolution is more expensive than resolving it. I'd like to resolve it. My brother looked at his hands. My father said, You're really leaving. I said, I left Friday night. I just needed the paperwork to catch up. By the following Thursday, the funds were transferred. I signed my resignation. The company issued a press release describing the transition as a planned strategic evolution, with the founding generation stepping into advisory roles. My name appeared once in a line about long-term contributions to operational growth. It was accurate. It was also the least they could do. Gerald got a long service bonus 2 weeks later. I made sure of it when I ran into him in the parking garage on my last day, picking up the last box from my office. He held the elevator for me and said, I'm glad it worked out, Miss Lydia. I said, Thank you for stopping me that night. He shrugged. He said, I've watched you work for 9 years. Seemed like you deserved to know. That was it. No speech. No ceremony. Just a man who paid attention, and a woman who finally did too. My brother texted me once, about a month later, just checking in. I replied, I'm good, because I was. My father called on a Sunday. We talked for 40 minutes, about the company when it started, about a trip we took to the Okanagan when I was 12, about nothing in particular. It wasn't forgiveness, exactly. It wasn't closure. It was more like two people deciding to keep knowing each other despite everything, because the alternative is worse, and also because I think he was genuinely sorry, even if he'd never quite find the words for it. I used my buyout to lease office space in the distillery district and spend 4 months quietly building out a consulting practice for logistics operations. My first client was Mr. Dunn's, Patterson, who called me 3 weeks after my resignation and said, I'd like to continue working with you, personally, if that's an option. It was. My second client came to a referral from the Mississauga distribution partner who'd been at the gala, the one who'd looked at me with confusion when my name wasn't called. It turned out a lot of people had noticed that. I just hadn't known until they started calling. There's something they don't tell you about the kind of betrayal that comes from your own family. It doesn't just hurt. It clarifies. Every assumption you made about who you were to these people, every story you told yourself about why you worked so hard and what it was building toward, all of it comes into sudden sharp focus. And some of it is painful to see clearly. But some of it is useful. I was useful to them. I know that now. I was structural. I was the load-bearing wall they decorated around and assumed would stay. But walls don't have to stay, especially when they're the only ones who know exactly which bolts are holding the ceiling up. The night before my father's retirement party, Gerald stopped me in the parking garage because he thought I deserved to know what was happening in my own company. He was right. And I spent the next 3 weeks making sure that what I knew became the most important thing in every room I walked into. I don't manage someone else's legacy anymore. I'm building my own. From a small office with good windows and a corkboard covered in contracts that have my name on them and only my name because I put it there, and I understand every clause and nobody is erasing it. I still think about the parking garage sometimes. The fluorescent hum, the smell of cold concrete, my garment bag over one arm and mascara still drying. Gerald standing there with 9 years of quiet observation behind his eyes, saying simply, Something doesn't feel right about tonight. He had no obligation to say anything. He wasn't paid to look out for me. He just did, because he'd watched me work, and decided I deserved to know. That's the part that got me, honestly, not the betrayal. The kindness of a near stranger who paid more attention than the people who were supposed to love me. I thought a lot about why things unfolded the way they did. Not in a bitter way, More like someone trying to understand a structure after it collapses, wanting to know which joint failed first. And what I keep coming back to is that the people who tried to push me out weren't cruel exactly. They were just careless. They assumed I would absorb it the way I'd absorbed everything else. The late nights, the covered meetings, the co-signed loans nobody talked about at dinner. They had built a story where I was useful but not essential, visible but not irreplaceable, and they'd told that story to themselves so many times they'd stopped checking whether it was true. The thing about integrity is that it doesn't announce itself. I inserted those continuity clauses 3 years before I ever needed them. Not out of suspicion, but because I genuinely understood the relationships I'd built and wanted to protect them properly. That's just how I worked. Carefully, thoroughly, with attention to the parts most people skip. I didn't do it to protect myself from my own family. I did it because it was the right way to do the work. And then, when it mattered, the right way turned out to also be the necessary way. What I've come to understand is that real intelligence isn't only about being smart in the room. It's about being honest with yourself outside of it, about seeing clearly who you are, what you've actually built, and what you're worth, without waiting for someone else to confirm it for you. For a long time, I think I outsourced that confirmation to my father's company, to the title, to the sense that being indispensable was the same as being valued. It isn't. Those are two entirely different things, and the gap between them is where a lot of pain lives. The resilience part I'm still figuring out. Not the dramatic version, the email sent at 8,055, the vendors called, the clauses invoked. That came from a cold, clear place and honestly felt more like problem solving than strength. The harder version is the quieter one. Continuing to show up, building the consulting practice month by month, taking Mr. Patterson's call and not letting the bitterness of how things ended color the professionalism of what came next. That's the part that takes something out of you and asks you to put something back in. Daily, without applause. Gerald got his bonus. I made sure of it. That felt important to me in a way I couldn't fully explain at the time. Maybe it still is just this. When someone does the right thing, you acknowledge it. You don't let it disappear into the background the way good people so often do. I don't fund someone else's legacy anymore. I know what I'm building and whose name is on it. That clarity I've learned is not something anyone can give you. You earn it the hard way, in parking garages and at kitchen tables at 2 in the morning, when you finally stop waiting to be seen and start deciding what you're going to do about it.